Welcome to a story so brutal and disturbing that even modern crime documentaries wouldn't dare to touch it. What you're about to hear is a true historical revenge rooted in suffering, silence, and unimaginable cruelty, a crime carried out inside the scorching sugar vats, where justice never existed and mercy was unknown. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, because uncovering stories like this requires deep research into real records, hidden testimonies, and history that was deliberately buried. This is not fiction. This is one of the darkest acts of revenge history tried to erase. Life on a sugar plantation was a slow, grinding descent into exhaustion, pain, and silence. And for the enslaved people trapped there, every day began with dread and ended in survival rather than rest. Sugar was called white gold, but it was built on blood. Before sunrise, the fields were already alive with movement, chains clinking softly as bodies were forced into motion. Men, women, and even children were driven into endless rows of cane, their hands blistered raw by the sharp leaves that sliced skin like knives. The air was heavy with humidity, thick enough to choke, and the ground burned beneath bare feet. There was no pause, no mercy for weakness, no forgiveness for mistakes. The overseers ruled the fields with whips and fear. Their voices carried farther than their footsteps, barking orders, counting bundles, watching for the slightest sign of slowing down. A man who stumbled from heat exhaustion was not helped. He was beaten until he stood again or dragged aside and left in the dirt. The work didn't stop for sickness, injury, or grief. Pregnant women labored until the moment they collapsed. If someone died in the field, their body was pulled into the shade, and the others were forced to keep cutting cane, their eyes fixed forward, pretending nothing had happened. But the fields were only the beginning. The real horror waited inside the sugar house. When the harvested cane was brought in, it was crushed, boiled, and refined in massive vats heated by roaring fires. The heat inside those buildings was unbearable, far worse than the sun outside. The air burned the lungs, sweat poured constantly, and the floor was slick with syrup and water. One wrong step could mean slipping into machinery or falling into a vat of boiling sugar. These accidents happened often, and when they did, they were not called tragedies. They were called losses of property. Enslaved workers assigned to the sugar house were considered expendable. They worked through the night, feeding cane into crushing rollers, stirring vats with long wooden poles, skimming scalding foam from the surface. Burns were common. Scars covered arms, legs, and backs, reminders of moments when someone moved too slowly or was shoved too close by an overseer's hand. Screams were swallowed by the roar of fire and machinery, and by morning, no one spoke of what had happened. Pain was expected. Silence was enforced. The masters lived far from this reality. Their homes sat at a distance, clean and quiet, separated by fields that acted like a buffer between comfort and cruelty. They measured success in barrels and profit, not in lives. If production fell, punishment followed. Rations were cut. Whippings increased. Families were separated as warnings. A man might be sold away for speaking out. A woman might be punished for slowing down. Children learned early that survival meant obedience, and obedience meant silence. Fear was the true currency of the plantation. It kept people moving even when their bodies begged to stop. It kept mouths shut when injustice burned inside. But fear does something else too. It builds pressure. And on sugar plantations, That pressure had nowhere to go. There was no escape into the wilderness for most. Dogs, patrols, and geography made running nearly impossible. There was no court, no law that recognized an enslaved person as human. Every humiliation, every beating, every loss stacked on top of the last, forming a weight that crushed hope slowly, day by day. Among the enslaved, whispers traveled quietly at night. Stories of men who snapped, of women who fought back and vanished, of accidents that didn't feel like accidents. These stories were never spoken loudly, but never confirmed, but they lived in the shared understanding that something inside people was breaking. The sugar vats, with their boiling heat and deadly depths, became symbols of that breaking point. They were places where life ended suddenly, where bodies could disappear, where screams could be erased by steam. Everyone knew the danger. Everyone feared them. The overseers used that fear deliberately. They threatened punishment in the sugar house, knowing the terror it inspired. They forced people to work faster around the vats, laughing when someone flinched too close to the edge. The masters believed control was absolute. They believed fear had won. What they never considered was what happens when fear turns into something else, something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. Because beneath the obedience, beneath the bowed heads and silent suffering, anger was growing. Not loud anger, not reckless rage. This was the kind that waits, the kind that watches, the kind that learns every corner of the plantation, every shift change, every blind spot. Sugar plantations were designed to extract everything from a human being: strength, time, dignity, life itself. And when nothing is left to lose, survival transforms into something darker. This was the world that created the crime history tried to bury. A place where brutality was routine, where death was normalized, and where revenge didn't come screaming, it came quietly, patiently, born from years of cruelty inside the heat and shadows of the sugar vats. The enslaved man at the center of this story had learned, early in his life, that pain was not an event, it was a condition. He had been born on the plantation, raised under the crack of the whip and the constant reminder that his body did not belong to him. From childhood, he worked the cane fields, his small hands torn by sharp leaves, his back scarred before he was old enough to understand why. By the time he was a man, there was very little left in him that had not already been taken: strength, family, even his name. The overseers called him only what was convenient, and the masters barely noticed him at all. To them, he was just another tool in the system that kept sugar flowing and money pouring in. What set him apart was not rage, but endurance. He rarely spoke. He followed orders. He survived punishments that broke others. This made him valuable. And that made his life worse. He was moved from the fields to the sugar house, where the heat was relentless and the danger constant. There, he watched men lose fingers, skin, and sometimes their lives to the machinery and the boiling vats. He helped carry bodies out when accidents happened, his face blank, his hands shaking just enough to remind him he was still alive. But survival came at a cost. Over time, everything he loved was stripped away. His wife was sold to another plantation after refusing the advances of an overseer. His young son was taken after collapsing from exhaustion in the fields, officially listed as lost, though everyone knew what that meant. There was no grave, no explanation, just absence. And with that absence came something far more dangerous than fear. Fear keeps a person obedient. Loss makes them hollow. And when someone becomes hollow enough, they stop being afraid of consequences. The man continued working as if nothing had changed, but something inside him had gone silent. He no longer flinched when the whip cracked nearby. He no longer looked away when cruelty unfolded in front of him. He watched. He remembered. He learned. The overseer assigned to the sugar house was known for his cruelty. He pushed workers closer to the vats, mocked their burns, and punished hesitation with violence. He enjoyed reminding them how easily a body could disappear in boiling sugar. He believed terror was control. What he didn't realize was that repetition breeds familiarity, and familiarity kills fear. The enslaved man learned exactly how hot the vats burned, how long it took before sound was swallowed by steam, how the sugar thickened and erased all trace of what fell inside. At night, while others slept from exhaustion, he lay awake listening to the plantation breathe. He memorized patterns: when guards changed, when the overseer drank, when the sugar house was loudest and least observed. He did not speak of revenge. He did not share his thoughts. What grew inside him was not explosive rage, but a cold, deliberate resolve. He did not want escape. He did not want justice. He wanted balance. In a world where pain had been given freely and endlessly, he decided pain would be returned, not randomly, not wildly, but precisely. The sugar vats were not chosen by chance. They were the heart of the plantation's cruelty, the place where profit and suffering met. The same place where lives had vanished without record would become the place where cruelty answered for itself. To the outside world, if anyone ever learned of it, the act would seem monstrous. But within the reality of the plantation, it was inevitable. Years of dehumanization had reshaped his understanding of right and wrong. When a system teaches a person that their life has no value, it should not be surprised when that person stops valuing the lives of those who enforce it. The man did not see himself as evil. He did not see himself as a hero either. He saw himself as something the plantation had created, a consequence. Every scar on his body was a lesson taught by force. Every loss was a reminder that mercy did not exist there. And so, when the moment came, he did not hesitate. He did not pray. He did not cry out. He acted with the same cold efficiency the plantation had demanded of him his entire life. This was not madness. It was clarity, the kind that comes when fear finally dies and only purpose remains. The masters believed they owned his body, his labor, his future. What they never owned was the breaking point they were so carefully building. And when that breaking point arrived, it did not announce itself with chaos. It arrived quietly, walking into the sugar house like any other shift, carrying years of suffering, and leaving behind a crime history would rather forget. The act itself did not happen in a moment of chaos or blind fury. It unfolded during an ordinary shift, in the same way countless days on the plantation had begun, quietly, predictably, almost boring in their cruelty. The sugar house was alive with heat and noise. Fires roared beneath the vats. Thick steam curled into the rafters, and the heavy smell of boiling cane clung to the air. Men worked shoulder to shoulder, stirring, lifting, skimming. Their movements mechanical from exhaustion. In that environment, nothing seemed out of place. And that was exactly why no one noticed what was coming. The enslaved man moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there. He had worked those vats long enough to know their rhythm. When the boiling reached its peak, when the steam grew thick enough to blind, when the roar of fire swallowed every sound. He knew which overseer favored the sugar house that night, and more importantly, he knew the man's habits. The overseer liked to stand close, too close, leaning over the vats to intimidate the workers, reminding them with a grin how fragile their bodies were against that heat. He believed fear made him untouchable. The moment came without warning. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic build-up. Just a brief shift in position, a slip that looked accidental to anyone glancing from a distance. In a place where falls were common and accidents expected, a sudden movement meant nothing. Steam surged upward, obscuring sight. The noise of boiling sugar drowned everything else. For a few seconds, no one saw clearly, and by the time the steam thinned, it was already over. What followed was confusion, not panic but disbelief. Workers froze, unsure whether to react or pretend nothing had happened. On a plantation, reacting was dangerous. Drawing attention could be fatal. The enslaved man did not run. He did not shout. He stepped back into line, lowered his eyes, and resumed his task like nothing had changed. That calm was what saved him. Panic would have betrayed guilt. Stillness hid it. The absence was noticed slowly. Overseers were often drunk, careless, wandering off without notice. Minutes passed before someone asked where he was. Then longer. When his voice didn't answer, when he didn't reappear from behind the vats, unease crept in. A search began, hesitant at first, because no one wanted to look too closely. Everyone knew what those vats could do. Everyone feared what might be found, or not found. What they discovered was almost worse than certainty. There was no clear evidence, no body, no struggle, just the relentless boiling, indifferent and unchanged, continuing its work as it always had. The sugar house swallowed the truth the same way it had swallowed countless lives before, without witness, without record. The masters would later call it an accident. That word had covered many deaths. It required no investigation, no blame, no disruption to business. But among the enslaved workers, the meaning was clear. No one spoke of it openly. They exchanged glances, subtle and heavy with understanding. In a world where power was absolute and resistance meant death, something impossible had happened. Not an escape, not a rebellion, a correction. Quiet, precise, and final. The man who carried it out returned to his quarters that night like everyone else. He ate when told, slept when allowed, rose before dawn as usual. Nothing about him changed on the surface. That was the most unsettling part. There was no visible transformation, no sign of release or satisfaction, only a stillness deeper than before. Whatever he had carried inside him for years had been set down at last, not in celebration, but in completion. By morning, the plantation resumed its routine. Sugar had to be processed. Profits could not wait. Another overseer took the missing man's place. Orders were barked. Whips cracked. The system continued as if nothing had happened, and that, more than anything, revealed the truth. The plantation did not mourn its dead. It replaced them. Whether the life lost belonged to an enslaved man or the one who enforced suffering, the machine kept moving. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Fear, once one-sided, had cracked. The masters would never admit it. But unease followed them into the sugar house after that day. They stood farther back from the vats. Their laughter grew tighter, forced. They no longer leaned so casually over boiling sugar. Somewhere deep down, they understood what had been proven, that the cruelty they relied on could turn inward. that the same silence they imposed could be used against them. The crime was never recorded as revenge. History would not allow that framing. It would be buried under words like misfortune and accident. But for those who lived and labored there, the truth lingered in the steam and heat of the sugar house. They knew that in the place where lives were erased daily, one act had broken the rules without breaking the routine. No uprising, no escape. Just a single, deliberate moment that reminded everyone, even the powerful, that brutality does not disappear. It waits, and sometimes it answers back in the very place it was born. The discovery did not come with screams or chaos. It came with silence, the kind that settles in when everyone already knows the truth, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. When the overseer failed to appear for the next shift, the plantation paused in a way it never did for enslaved lives. Time stretched. Orders went unanswered. The sugar house, usually loud with shouting and fire, felt tense and watchful. Masters disliked disorder, and absence created questions they did not want asked. At first, they assumed the overseer had wandered off drunk or injured himself somewhere on the grounds. Searches were routine when property went missing. Men were sent to check the quarters, the paths, the edge of the fields. His name was called once, maybe twice, not with concern, but irritation. When he did not answer, the search moved reluctantly toward the sugar house. No one volunteered. Everyone understood what the vats meant. Inside, the fires still burned. The vats still boiled. Everything looked exactly as it had the night before. That sameness was unsettling. There were no overturned tools, no signs of struggle, no blood, no clear evidence of anything at all. Only a missing man and vats that had continued doing what they always did, erasing. Someone shut down the fire beneath one vat and stirred carefully, slowly, hoping to find certainty. They found none, and that absence became the answer. The master arrived later, angry rather than afraid. Anger was easier. Anger preserved authority. He asked questions that were meant to close the matter, not open it. Was the overseer careless? Had he been drinking? Did anyone see him stumble? Head stayed bowed. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. That was the truth that mattered. The master declared it an accident before sunset, and with that declaration, the plantation exhaled. Accidents required no blame. No blame required no punishment. Business could continue. But beneath the official explanation, something had shifted. The enslaved workers understood the rules of survival. Silence was safety. To speak would invite scrutiny, and scrutiny always landed on them. So they said nothing, not because they didn't know, but because they knew too well. The sugar house swallowed noise, and it had swallowed truth with it. The plantation had taught them how to disappear without leaving a trace. Now that lesson had turned inward. The overseer's belongings were gathered and boxed. A replacement arrived within days, briefed only on production numbers and expectations. No sermon was given, no memorial held. Life moved forward at the pace profit demanded. That, more than anything, made the event feel unreal. The machine did not pause. It simply adjusted. And yet, the adjustment was visible in small, telling ways. The new overseer kept his distance from the vats. He spoke less. He watched more. The masters began visiting the sugar house less frequently, preferring reports over presence. Rules were not softened, but the swagger disappeared. Threats were still made, but they carried a different tone, tighter, cautious. Fear had learned a new shape. It was no longer one-directional. Among the enslaved, the silence was heavy but not empty. It carried meaning. Eyes met briefly and looked away. There were no celebrations, no whispered praise. What had happened was not freedom, not justice. It was a reminder that even inside a system designed to crush every possibility, consequences could still find their way back to those who believed themselves untouchable. At night, the sugar house felt different. The fires crackled the same. The vats boiled the same, but people moved with an awareness sharpened by memory. The place had always been dangerous. Now it was also symbolic. It held proof that cruelty could be answered without banners or speeches, without escape or uprising, with the same quiet finality the plantation itself used every day. The official record remained clean. Ledgers showed production uninterrupted. The overseer's name faded from schedules and was replaced by another. That erasure was intentional. To acknowledge anything more would invite questions about control, about vulnerability. Masters relied on the idea that power was absolute. What happened threatened that idea, so it was buried beneath routine. Years later, when the story surfaced in fragments, it was framed as rumor, exaggeration, or cautionary tale. History prefers clean edges. It prefers to call such moments accidents and move on. But for those who were there, the memory lingered, not as spectacle, but as understanding. They had seen the system reveal a crack, however small. The silence that followed was not empty, because it was chosen. It was enforced, internalized, and shared. It protected those who needed protection and preserved the illusion for those who demanded it. The sugar vats continued to boil. The plantation continued to grind forward. And somewhere within that unbroken routine, a truth remained unspoken but unforgettable: that brutality, when normalized long enough, does not disappear. It teaches, it adapts, and sometimes it answers back in the only language the system understands: quiet, irreversible consequence. What followed was not justice, not closure, and certainly not peace. What followed was deliberate forgetting, a slow, careful burial of truth that became just as important as the crime itself. The plantation could not afford memory. Memory created questions, and questions threatened order. So the event was sealed away, not with walls or locks, but with routine. Ledgers were rewritten, timelines adjusted. Words like missing and accident replaced anything that hinted at intent. History, at least the version allowed to survive, was reshaped in real time. The master understood something crucial: punishment was unnecessary if fear could be redirected. Investigations invite scrutiny, and scrutiny invites vulnerability. Instead of interrogations, there was dismissal. Instead of inquiry, there was certainty. The overseer, they said, had been careless. The sugar house was dangerous. Tragedies happened. That explanation traveled faster than the truth ever could. It was repeated until it became solid, until even those who doubted it learned to repeat it for safety's sake. Among the enslaved, the silence hardened into instinct. Speaking would not bring relief or reward. It would only bring attention. Attention was lethal. They had watched enough lives erased to understand how quickly the focus could shift from an absent overseer to a convenient scapegoat. So the story remained fragmented, half glances, unfinished sentences, memories shared only in the privacy of the mind. Silence was not agreement, it was survival. Over time, the sugar vats themselves became part of the erasure. They were scrubbed, repurposed, replaced. Fires burned away residue, but not meaning. New workers arrived who had never known the overseer, never sensed the shift. To them, the plantation was simply brutal in the way all plantations were brutal. They did not inherit the story, only the rules. And those rules demanded obedience, not curiosity. The replacement overseer enforced discipline with caution. He never stood too close to the vats. He never lingered alone after dark. He punished publicly and predictably, avoiding the kind of excess that had once been routine. The masters noticed but did not comment. They preferred efficiency over cruelty that drew attention. The system adapted, not out of morality, but self-preservation. That adaptation was perhaps the most unsettling part. It proved the system could change when it felt threatened, but never for the sake of those it oppressed. Years passed. Records aged. Papers yellowed. The Civil War approached, and with it, larger disruptions that swallowed smaller ones. Against the backdrop of national catastrophe, one missing overseer became insignificant. That was the final layer of burial context. When history grows loud enough, individual truths disappear into the noise. When fragments of the story surfaced later, they were treated as folklore. Sugar plantation legends. Exaggerations whispered to frighten children or dramatize cruelty already known. Scholars dismissed them because documentation was thin, intentionally so. The absence of evidence became evidence of absence. That was the plantation's final victory over the truth. But erasure is never complete. It leaves stains, not on paper, but on behavior, on patterns, on what people avoid. The sugar house retained a quiet gravity long after the event. Workers rotated assignments there more frequently than elsewhere. No one stayed long. Fires were never left unattended. Accidents declined sharply. These changes were never explained, never recorded, but they were real. The system had learned from what it refused to acknowledge. The story survived in pieces because pieces were safer than wholes. A sentence here. A warning there. A look that lingered too long when the vats were mentioned. These fragments passed between generations, altered but persistent. They carried less detail and more meaning. They said that power was not invincible. That silence could be chosen, not imposed. That sometimes history hides not because it is false, but because it is too dangerous to face honestly. What history never wanted remembered was not the act itself, but what it represented. It disrupted the narrative of absolute control. It suggested that even within the most violent systems, responses could occur outside the expected scripts of rebellion or submission. That possibility was terrifying to those who benefited from order built on suffering. So the story was buried not once, but repeatedly, by records, by time, by denial, and yet the very effort to erase it ensured its survival. Forgotten things do not require maintenance. This did. It required silence, reinforcement, repetition. It required people to agree, knowingly or not, to look away. That collective effort is the shadow the story casts across history. Not the crime alone, but the collaboration that followed. The shared decision to let truth sink beneath boiling surfaces and pretend nothing had changed. That is why the story never fully disappeared, because history does not forget what systems work hardest to hide. It waits. It lingers in margins and memories, resurfacing when someone finally asks why the silence was so carefully preserved.